Preston handed me his father's watch on his way out the door and called it a parting gift, the kind you give someone you're already finished with. A number floated over it at the repair shop 40 minutes later, gold letters only I could see, estimated value, $1.2 million. Wrong drawer, Preston. I didn't say that last part out loud. I said it inside my own skull over and over, while a stranger in a leather apron turned the watch under a jeweler's loop like it might bite him. "Where did you get this?" he asked, not suspicious, careful, the kind of question with a bigger question hiding underneath it. "My husband," I said, soon to be ex. He said it was junk from a drawer at his mother's house, wanted me to have something appropriately sentimental on my way out. The man behind the counter, a nameplate that said Whitlock, a face that hadn't yet decided whether to be kind to me, set the lap down slowly, the way you'd set down something that might go off. Whoever told him that, he said, was either an idiot or lying to him. The gold number hung there an inch above the case back, visible to nobody in that shop but me. Nobody but me for 6 weeks now, ever since the morning I signed my name to a piece of paper that ended 14 years of loving one family harder than they had ever once loved me back. I didn't understand the number yet. I would. 3 months before that morning, none of this would have made sense to me. Not the number, not a stranger named Whitlock going quiet over a 50-year-old watch, none of it. 3 months before that, I was still Nora Ainsworth, and I still believed, the specific stubborn way you believe a thing you've built your whole adult life on top of, that if I stayed patient enough, useful enough, quiet enough, the Ainsworths would eventually decide I belonged to them. I grew up 2 miles and one entire universe away from Chestnut Hill, in the back room of a pawn shop on Dorchester Avenue that my father ran for 31 years, Callahan's Loan and Jewelry, a steel security grate, a bell over the door that stuck every August. A father who taught me to tell real gold from plated brass before I'd finished the 4th grade, the same patient way other kids learned their multiplication tables. "Anybody can tell you a thing is valuable," he used to say, turning a ring under his lip while I did homework on an overturned milk crate. Took me 20 years to learn how to actually see it for myself. I thought that was just something shopkeepers said. I didn't know it was going to become literal. Her study in particular was the one room in the Chestnut Hill house I was never quite trusted to be alone in, an odd thing to notice about your own mother-in-law's house, for 4 straight years, until suddenly it wasn't odd at all. I met Preston Ainsworth when I was 26, appraising an estate lot for a client of his father's firm, and I mistook the way he looked at me, like I was something rare he'd found by accident, for the same hunger I felt, the same wish to be let into a life bigger than the one you were handed. It took me most of 4 years of marriage to understand the hunger only ever ran in one direction. He liked that I was different from his world. He never once let his world find out I wasn't temporary. His mother, Constance, had a gift for cruelty so smooth it barely left a mark going in. She called me resourceful. She called the shop charming in its way. When my father died 2 years ago, a bad heart, on an ordinary Tuesday, no warning at all, she sent a floral arrangement so enormous it blocked the shop's front door, and a card in her own hand, saying she hoped I'd consider this an opportunity to finally close that chapter. She didn't come to the funeral. Preston came for 40 minutes and left before the burial, because his mother needed him back for a foundation gala rehearsal. I told myself that was just an ordinary Ainsworth Tuesday. I didn't understand yet that it was a preview. By spring, Preston had started leaving his phone face down on every flat surface in our apartment, a small tell I chose not to read for months, because reading it would have ended something I still badly wanted to be real. Her name was Genevieve Marsh. Constance had known the Marsh family since before Preston and I had exchanged a single word. Genevieve had been engaged once to a man Constance approved of even less than she'd ever approved of me. And that engagement had ended 8 months earlier, and Genevieve had reappeared in Boston, and reappeared at the Foundation's spring benefit, and reappeared with a frequency that would only later strike me as engineered instead of accidental. Preston moved out on a Thursday. He was tidy about it, which was its own kind of insult. He'd clearly rehearsed the version of this where I made it easy for him. His lawyer had a property settlement drafted in 9 days flat, fast enough that I understood exactly how long he'd been quietly planning his exit, while I was still learning about it in real time. My own attorney, a college friend named Priya Nair who did divorce work as a favor between her actual caseload, made him itemize every single thing he handed back to me as officially mine, down to a coffee grinder, because she'd represented enough Ainsworth-adjacent men to know they liked to quietly reclaim things 18 months later, once the anger had cooled and the story had rewritten itself in their favor. Parting gift is what he called the watch, out loud in front of Priya the day he came to collect the last of his boxes. He didn't even look at it when he pulled it from his coat pocket, like it was an afterthought, a chore he wanted finished, something of Dad's. Mom says it's not worth anything, a copy he had made for travel years back. Figured you'd get a kick out of it. You always did like old things nobody else wanted. I signed the receipt. Priya slid across the counter, one line in her tidy paralegal hand. 1 man's wristwatch, family heirloom, estimated value nominal, transferred as parting personal property, Preston T. Ainsworth. He signed underneath it without reading a word. He was already checking the time on his phone. I didn't think about that piece of paper again for 6 weeks. I would think about almost nothing else later. I took the watch 3 streets from my new one-bedroom to be cleaned, because it had stopped ticking and I couldn't quite make myself throw away the one object Preston had touched on his way out the door that didn't come attached to strings. I'd walked past the shop 100 times without going in, until I remembered, halfway there, that my father used to send customers his own tools couldn't handle to a place on Charles Street called Whitlock's. Best eye on this side of the river, he used to say. I hadn't thought about that in years. My feet apparently remembered before I did. Elias Whitlock didn't look like a man who held other people's fortunes in the palm of his hand for a living. He looked like a man who'd forgotten to go home the night before, sleeves rolled to the elbow, ink at his cuticles, a workbench cluttered with tools I couldn't have named if you'd paid me. It took him 4 minutes with the loop to go quiet in a way I'd learn, over the following weeks, was not a thing he did casually or often. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I need you to actually think about the answer instead of giving me the polite one. Who told you this was a reproduction? My ex-husband, his mother originally, I think. Has anyone in that family ever had this piece independently appraised? Anyone outside the family? I doubt it, they're not exactly hurting for cash. He didn't answer that directly. He set the watch down on a square of black velvet like it was something that could still be startled. People don't get careless with things they think are worth something, he said. They get careless with things they decided, a long time ago, not to look at too closely. That was the first time I saw the number. Gold, floating steady, so obviously real that for 10 full seconds I assumed I was having some kind of episode, grief finally catching up to my nervous system in the strangest way it knew how. Estimated $100,000. I must have made a sound because Elias looked up sharply. You okay? I said I was fine. I was not fine. I was standing in a stranger's shop discovering that either I'd lost my mind, or my ex-mother-in-law had handed me, out of nothing but spite and carelessness, more money than my father's shop had grossed in 3 decades of steel grates and stuck bells. I can't give you anything official without proper authentication, Elias said, misreading my silence for skepticism about him instead of about my own eyes. But unofficially off the record, between us, this isn't a copy. Corbin and Vane didn't make copies. Maybe 40 pieces a year, out of a workshop the size of my back room, and they closed their doors in 1958. Every single thing that's left with their mark on it is spoken for, 3 private collections in Europe, 2 museums, nothing that's ever gone to public auction. He turned the case back toward me, and there, engraved so small I'd have missed it without his finger tracing it, was a tiny pressed crest, an oak leaf, a fox, initials worn nearly smooth. This has family provenance stamped straight into the metal. Somebody in your husband's family has known exactly what this is for a very long time. Ex-husband, I said, mostly to have something true left to hold on to. Something in his face eased, just slightly, like he'd been waiting to hear that word before he let himself be as kind as he apparently wanted to be. If anyone comes around asking hard questions about this piece, he said, you call me before you call anyone else. Not because I need the business, because I've spent 15 years learning how to tell the difference between what's real and what somebody's decided to call fake, and I am not about to get it wrong about you. I didn't know yet how many different ways he meant that. The first call came from Constance herself, 9 days later on a Tuesday evening, her voice pitched to the particular register she used when she wanted something, and had decided charm would get her there faster than a demand ever would. Nora, darling, I hear Preston gave you Walter's old travel watch. Silly thing to have kicking around a drawer. I've been meaning to have it for the memorial display at the foundation gala. Sentimental, you understand. Walter's father carried something similar, and I realized how thoughtless it was of Preston not to think of that before he went handing out mementos. Would you drop it by the house this week? I'll have the housekeeper send you something lovely in exchange. A candle, perhaps. A candle. She was offering me a candle for a piece that had made a professional horologist go still and careful. I think I'll hold on to it, actually, I said. Preston gave it to me. It's mine now. The pause on the other end of the line lasted exactly long enough for me to hear underneath it, a woman recalibrating in real time. Of course, Constance said, her voice smoothing back over like water closing above a dropped stone. Whatever makes you comfortable, dear. It really is such a small thing. She hung up before I could answer. I stood in my kitchen a long time afterward, watch box in my hand, understanding for the first time that a small thing does not get followed up on 9 days later by the mother of the man who called it worthless in the first place. Preston called 2 days after that, which told me more about the chain of command in that family than 4 years of marriage ever had. Mom says you're being difficult about Dad's watch, he said. No hello first, which was its own tell. Preston led with apologies when he wanted something small, and led with accusations when his mother wanted something big. I'm not being anything, it's mine. You gave it to me, you signed the receipt. It's a $200 reproduction, Nora. It's not a war crime to want a piece of my dead father back for his own memorial. Then why does your mother keep calling? Silence. The specific silence of a man who hasn't asked himself that question and doesn't want to start now. Can you just for once not make everything a production? I gave you plenty in that settlement, the car, half the furniture. I'm trying to be decent here. You gave me a receipt for a $200 watch and kept the wedding albums, I said, and heard my own voice crack on albums, the one thing in that entire 9-day fast settlement I'd actually asked Priya to fight for and lost, 'cause Preston's lawyer had argued the photographer's contract technically routed the prints through his father's estate LLC. 6 years, 4 continents, 140 photographs, filed like office furniture. So forgive me if I'm not in a rush to hand over the one thing you actually meant as an insult. That's not. He stopped, started again, quieter, and for one unguarded second I heard something that might have been the boy I married instead of the man his mother had spent 2 years rebuilding out of him. You're really going to fight me over an old watch? I'm not fighting you over anything, Preston. I'm just not giving it back. He hung up. I sat on my new secondhand couch in my new 1-bedroom and didn't cry, because apparently I'd used up an entire marriage's worth of tears already, and my body had quietly decided we were done with that particular currency. I went back to Whitlock's 3 days later with a bag of coffee and no real excuse, and Elias didn't ask me for one. He had the watch open on the bench, the movement exposed like something breathing, tiny gears catching the afternoon light through the front window. Most people don't come back to a watch shop to hang out, he said, not looking up. Most people's watch repairman doesn't say things like someone's known exactly what this is for a very long time and then send them home to sit that alone. That got a real laugh out of him, short and surprised, like it had escaped before he could decide whether to let it. Fair. Occupational hazard. I spend so much time with things nobody looks at closely that I forget people need a minute to process. Is that a metaphor? Depends how much coffee you brought me. We talked for an hour that didn't feel like an hour, about nothing that mattered and everything that did. His grandfather, Samuel, who'd opened the shop in 1961 with a workbench and a reputation for honesty that had outlasted 3 separate waves of Beacon Hill gentrification. My father, who used to let me stay up past bedtime cataloging estate jewelry, because he said a kid who could spot a fake ruby by age 9 would never be lied to about anything that mattered for the rest of her life. Elias didn't flinch at pawn shop. He leaned into it, actually, asked real questions, the kind that meant he was listening instead of waiting for his turn to talk. Your dad sounds like he'd have liked this shop, he said at one point, and something in my chest that had been clenched for 2 straight years came loose by about a single degree. Before I left, he held the door and said, quiet, almost like he hadn't planned to say it out loud. For what it's worth, whatever they're circling back for, it isn't sentiment. Nobody offers a candle in trade for sentiment. I hadn't told him about the candle. I didn't tell you that part, I said. You didn't have to. It's the kind of thing people like that offer, when they think you'll take it. A beat. I grew up watching my grandfather deal with families exactly like that. You learn to recognize the shape of it, even without the specifics. I should have asked him what he meant by that. I was too busy noticing the way he'd said families like that, like a man with a very specific family somewhere in the back of his mind, and not asking, because some part of me, the part that had spent 4 years learning not to ask questions the Ainsworths didn't want asked, was afraid of what the answer might cost me. The Ainsworths' attorney came to Callahan's the following week. Not Constance, she was smarter than that. She sent a man named Whitfield Reyes, in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent, who stood in the middle of my father's shop like the steel security grates might be contagious, and offered me $8,000 cash same day, for the travel watch currently in your possession. No discussion needed, he said. Just a number and a pen. $8,000. For a 50-year-old reproduction. That's a generous number for something that isn't worth anything, I said. The family would simply like this resolved quietly and quickly, out of respect for a difficult time, Reyes said in the tone of a man reading from a script he considered slightly beneath him. Then they can respect it by leaving me alone. It's mine, I have a signed receipt. A settlement document can always be revisited, Miss Callahan, particularly where there's evidence of a mutual mistake as to value. He said mutual mistake the way you'd say a phrase you'd practiced in a mirror that morning. I'd encourage you to think carefully before making this more difficult than it needs to be. He left a business card on the glass counter my father had installed with his own 2 hands in 1994, and walked out past a customer bringing in her late husband's cufflinks, without holding the door. I stood there a long time after the bell stopped shaking, finally understanding that resolved quietly had never once been offered to me in good faith. 3 days later, though I wouldn't hear about this call until much later, from someone who'd lost every reason left to protect Constance Ainsworth. This is what happened in her study on Suffolk Road, on a Thursday afternoon while I was 3 miles away pricing a stranger's grandmother's engagement ring. Constance sat at Walter's old desk with the phone on speaker, low, a man's voice on the other end, clipped and faintly accented, impatient in the specific way of someone who has already been kept waiting once. Miss Ainsworth. My client is a patient man, but patience has a shelf life, and yours expired 2 weeks ago. He put down a $400,000 deposit for delivery by the 15th. If the piece isn't in Zurich by then, he wants his money back, and he wants to know why a watch I was told had already changed hands safely twice is suddenly tangled up with lawyers and an ex-daughter-in-law. It is being handled, feel it. Handling isn't delivery, Mrs. Ainsworth. You told me this would be simple, a quiet family transaction, nobody mentioned a divorce. Constance's voice, when it came back, had none of the honeyed warmth she kept in reserve for people she still needed something from. It will be handled. She's sentimental and broke and alone, she'll fold. She was wrong about 2 of those 3 things. She'd learn which 2 eventually, in a room full of people who had spent their whole lives believing whatever she told them to believe. None of that reached me yet. What reached me was smaller and sharper and arrived by mail 4 days later. A formal letter from the Ainsworth family's counsel, disputing the nominal value, line item in our settlement as a mutual mistake of fact, demanding the watch be surrendered into neutral third-party escrow pending review. My hands shook badly enough that I had to read it twice, standing at the counter, my father's old bell jangling behind some customer I couldn't focus enough to greet. I didn't sleep that night. Somewhere around 2 in the morning I opened a text thread to Constance and typed out 4 different versions of fine, come get it. I'm tired. I deleted every one of them before I hit send, not because I'd stopped being tired, but because some stubborn, exhausted part of me kept picturing my father's face, if I'd ever handed a customer back a ring the second someone with a nicer suit told her it wasn't real. I called Priya instead, at 2 in the morning, and she picked up on the second ring like she'd been waiting for exactly this call. Don't send it, she said before I'd even finished explaining. I know it's 3 a.m., and everything feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds right now. But this letter isn't about the watch, Nora. It's a pressure test. They're checking whether you'll fold before they have to actually prove anything. Don't give them the data. What if I just don't have the energy for this? Then borrow mine for a week, she said. That's what I'm here for. Go to sleep. We'll fight about it properly in the morning. I remembered, a few days after that, something I hadn't thought about in 2 years. The kind of memory that sits quietly in a back drawer of your own mind until the exact moment it's finally needed. The spring after Walter died, I'd gone to the Chestnut Hill house to help Preston sort his father's study. One maybe 4 times in 4 years Constance had let me pass the front hall unsupervised. I'd found a manila folder of estate paperwork on the desk, mostly boring insurance schedules, appraisal letters for the art collection, and one line on a page I'd barely glanced at before Constance in the doorway and told me, but very firmly, that the estate documents aren't really something you need to trouble yourself with, dear, had stuck with me only because of how oddly specific it was. Wristwatch, decorative reproduction. Est. Value $4,000 for insurance and estate tax purposes. I told Priya about it over the phone, half convinced it meant nothing. You remember that exactly? She asked. I have a strange memory for numbers. Comes from growing up in a shop where a decimal point in the wrong place cost my dad real money. Then that's not nothing, that's discovery, she said. I can subpoena Walter Ainsworth's estate tax filings as part of this dispute. It's directly relevant to the value they're suddenly disputing. And while I'm at it, I'm pulling any fine arts insurance riders tied the household, too. People who lowball the IRS on a piece almost never remember to lowball their own insurance company to match. It's the one place rich people never economize. I hadn't thought about that until she said it. I would think about it constantly, 3 weeks later, in a room with too much fluorescent light. The Ainsworth Family Foundation held its annual gala at the end of that month, black tie, a hotel ballroom over the harbor, the same event Walter had started years ago to fund pediatric cardiac research, and I almost didn't go. Priya talked me into it. Don't give her the satisfaction of an empty chair, she said. Sit in the front row and make her look at you. Constance found me by the dessert table, which I understood later wasn't an accident at all. She'd waited for a room full of the right witnesses. She had a way of raising her voice just enough to sound aggrieved instead of aggressive, pitched perfectly for an audience she'd already counted heads on. I think everyone here deserves to know, she said, not quite to me, more at me, angled toward a small cluster of donors nearby, that my former daughter-in-law is currently in possession of a family heirloom that does not belong to her, obtained under circumstances my attorneys are calling into serious question. I'd hoped we could resolve this like family. Apparently that isn't an option with some people. The room did the thing rooms do, a ripple, a hush, $300 of silk turning slightly in my direction. 2 years earlier I would have apologized my way out of that ballroom and cried in a hotel bathroom until the humiliation felt survivable again. I had done exactly that more than once for smaller offenses than this one. I didn't move. I have a signed receipt, Constance, I said loud enough to carry, from your son for property he gave me as part of a legal settlement. If you'd like to discuss it, my attorney's number is the same one your attorney already has. I held her eyes 1 second longer than was comfortable for either of us. I'm done doing this quietly for you. I don't owe your family quiet anymore. I left before she could answer, in the car, hands finally shaking now that no one could see them do it. I called Priya and told her I wanted everything moved. The authentication, the escrow demand, the estate filing, all of it, as fast and as publicly as the law would allow. You sure? She asked. Once we file formally, it's not quiet anymore. It's a hearing. People will know. Good, I said. I want people to know. Elias didn't hesitate when I called him that night and asked whether he'd formally authenticate the watch, on the record if it came to that. I was hoping you'd ask, he said. I've been sitting on something for 11 days, waiting for you to be ready to hear it. I didn't want to hand you one more shock before you had solid ground under your feet. He drove to my apartment instead of making me come to him, which I understood, even then, as its own kind of vow. My grandfather serviced this exact watch in 1974, he said, laying a photograph flat on my kitchen table. Black and white, a younger version of the face I now knew, bent over a workbench that could have been the same one still sitting in his shop, a watch under his loop, the same small crest just visible on the case back. He kept a ledger for every piece that passed through his hands, going back 60 years. I found this 3 days after you first walked into my shop, and I didn't say anything, because a photograph proves the watch is old. It doesn't prove what your husband's family did with the truth about it, and I wasn't going to hand you half a fact and let you build a whole case on it. What does the ledger say? That in 1974, a man named Ambrose Ainsworth brought in a Corbin and Vane wristwatch for cleaning, and had my grandfather make a single, exact travel copy, good enough to fool anyone but an expert, specifically so the original could stay in a vault and never travel again. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in a spidery, decades-old hand, someone had written, "For W, when he's finally ready to stop being careless with things he doesn't understand yet. Keep the real one safe until then." W, I said. Your father-in-law. I think his own father didn't fully trust him with it either once. It didn't prove Constance had lied on a federal document. It proved a copy had existed, deliberately, decades before Preston was even born, and that the family had always known exactly which watch was which. Which meant a $4,000 estate filing wasn't an honest mistake made by an overwhelmed, grieving widow. It was a choice made by a woman who knew precisely which watch was which, about which one to lie about on a federal form after her husband died with both of them sitting in the same drawer. 2 weeks before the hearing, Genevieve Marsh called me. I almost didn't pick up. "I'm not doing this for you," she said before I could say a word. "I'm doing it because Constance told me, 3 days after Preston and I reconnected last spring, how relieved she was to finally see him come to his senses, like I was a solution she'd engineered instead of a person who happened to run into her old college roommate at a gallery opening that Constance, I found out only last month, had personally arranged the seating chart for. I'm not proud of any of it, I just don't want to keep being the villain in a story somebody else wrote for me." I didn't forgive her, I'm not sure I ever fully will. But I believed her, and I wrote down the date of that gallery opening, because Priya had taught me by then that a date is the kind of thing that turns a feeling into a fact a hearing officer can actually use. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning at a downtown mediation office, the kind of room with a long table, bad coffee, and too much fluorescent light for the size of what was actually at stake. Constance's attorneys filed an emergency motion the Friday before, seeking to have the watch physically surrendered into court-controlled escrow ahead of the hearing, on the grounds that I posed a demonstrated flight and disposal risk. Language prilled me grimly, usually reserved for people accused of considerably worse things than getting divorced. They got the order. A courier came to Callahan's on Monday afternoon with paperwork and an escort, and I had to walk to the back safe, in front of a customer buying his daughter a communion bracelet, and hand over the one object in the entire mess that had briefly, stubbornly felt like it was mine. Somebody had tipped off a business reporter at the Sentinel by then, too. I never found out who, though I had a guess, and Tuesday morning's early edition ran 6 paragraphs under the headline "Divorce Dispute Over, Missing Ainsworth Heirloom Heeds to Herring," using the word missing like I'd broken into a vault instead of been handed the thing across my own kitchen table, by the man who was still, legally, my husband for 4 more days. I sat in my car outside the mediation office and couldn't make myself get out for a full 6 minutes. It had almost worked, not the legal motion but the shape of it. The quiet, respectable violence of being made to look, in 6 tidy paragraphs, exactly like the thing you'd spent 4 years being told you were. A person with less money and less name than everyone else in the room, finally caught reaching for something that was never supposed to be hers. Elias found me there. He didn't ask if I was okay. He opened my car door, crouched down to my eye level and said, "You know what a false read looks like on an old movement? Everything ticks. Nothing's actually moving anything forward. It just looks like time is passing." He held out his hand. "This is a false read, Nora. Not the end. Come inside and let's make the actual gears catch." Judge Doreen Okafor, retired unhurried, thoroughly unimpressed by suits that cost more than a month's rent, let Whitfield Reyes make his opening argument about mutual mistake of value for a full 11 minutes before she looked, for the first time mildly interested in the room around her. "Ms. Callahan's counsel," she said, "your witness." Priya called Elias first. He walked the authentication through plainly, atelier characteristics, the 1958 closure, the crest, 40 pieces a year for a workshop that had produced maybe 600 pieces in its entire existence, nearly all of them accounted for across 3 private European collections and 2 museums. Then Priya entered the 1974 ledger page and the photograph into the record, and read Samuel Whitlock's note aloud into a room that had gone very still. "For W, when he's finally ready to stop being careless with things he doesn't understand yet, keep the real one safe until then." "Objection," Reyes said, "relevance." "Overruled," Judge Okafor said without lifting her eyes from the page. "It's extremely relevant. Continue." Priya entered the estate tax filing next, 1 line item, $4,000, decorative reproduction, signed by Constance Ainsworth as executor 3 years ago, and beside it, a fine arts insurance rider, purchased through a private insurer 11 months later, covering the Ainsworth family watch collection for $1.3 million. 2 documents. 2 entirely different values for what the family's own case now insisted was a single, worthless copy. You can't declare an item worthless to the IRS, Priya said, and insure that same item for $1.3 million 11 months later, and then stand in this room today and call the difference a mutual mistake. That's not a mistake, Mrs. Ainsworth. That's a filing choice. Made twice. In 2 opposite directions depending which government agency happened to be asking. I watched something move across Constance's face that I had genuinely never once seen there. In 4 years of watching that face perform every other emotion available to a woman like her. It wasn't shame exactly. It was closer to a woman doing fast math and not liking a single one of the answers. "This is absurd," she said, too loud for the size of the room, her voice finally losing the register she'd spent 3 straight years of gala speeches polishing into place. "That watch has been in my family for 4 generations. I am not going to sit here and be lectured about paperwork by a girl who grew up selling other people's wedding rings out of a pawn shop." The room went very quiet. Even Reyes looked, for one unguarded second, like a man who wished his client had let him finish that sentence for her. "That girl," Judge Okafor said, mild as weather, still not lifting her eyes from the filing in front of her, "appears to be the only person in this room who's told the truth about this watch's value on a legal document at any point in the last 3 years. I'd be careful, Mrs. Ainsworth, about which one of you the state decides to lecture next." It came out after that in pieces, the way these things do once the first thread finally gets pulled. The broker in Zurich, a man named Felix Duart, the $400,000 deposit, the deadline 3 weeks out that Constance had been racing against with lowball offers and lawyers, eventually a public accusation flung across a dessert table, because quiet leverage had stopped working. Judge Okafor didn't have jurisdiction to prosecute tax fraud. That would be a different letter, to a different agency, filed the following week by Priya on my behalf, one Constance would spend the better part of the next year answering for, but she had more than enough sitting in front of her to rule on the thing actually in the room. "The settlement stands as written," she said. "The watch is Ms. Callahan's, free and clear, effective immediately. I'll also note for the record that a party who misdeclares an asset's value to a federal agency is poorly positioned to later argue, in a civil proceeding, that the same asset's value was a mutual mistake. You don't get to pick whichever number is convenient for the room you happen to be standing in, Mrs. Ainsworth. Not twice." Preston hadn't said one word through the entire hearing. By the end of it he looked like a man watching 2 separate buildings he'd been standing between finally finish collapsing into each other. He caught me in the hallway afterward, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't lead with an accusation or an apology, he just looked tired. "I really did think it was fake," he said, "for what that's worth." "I know," I said and meant it, which surprised us both. That was never actually the part that hurt Preston. I didn't wait to see if he understood what I meant by that. I had somewhere else to be. Whitfield Reyes withdrew from representing the Ainsworth Family Foundation 2 months later, once the fraud referral became a matter of public record and 2 board members quietly resigned rather than have their names sitting anywhere near it in the Sentinel. Constance kept the house on Suffolk Road. She lost the foundation's board chair, the one thing I came to understand slowly and a little sadly, she had actually built herself instead of simply inherited. Priya asked, once it was over, whether I wanted to go after her for defamation too, on top of everything else. I thought about it for exactly one night and let it go, not for Constance's sake, but because I didn't want to spend one more year of my life sitting in rooms like that. Genevieve moved to Chicago that fall for a job, she told a mutual friend, though I've always suspected Boston had simply gotten too small for the version of herself she'd stopped being able to stand. I kept the shop, I kept my name. I kept the watch too for exactly 4 more months, long enough to be sure I wasn't holding on to it out of spite, and then donated it to a small horological museum outside Philadelphia, on the condition that the placard credit both Corbin and Vane and Samuel's original 1974 ledger entry. Somewhere along the way I'd decided the truest thing about that watch was never the number that used to float over it. It was 60 years of one honest man's handwriting, quietly proving that somebody, somewhere, had always known exactly what it was worth, and had kept the receipts the whole time. Elias closed the shop early the day I told him, and we walked to the harbor with 2 coffees and no particular destination, which had become by then the thing we did instead of talking directly about anything that scared us. Wrong drawer, I said apropos of nothing, watching a container ship crawl toward the horizon. That's what I kept saying back at the very beginning. Preston grabbed the wrong drawer. He did. I don't think it was though. Not really. I think for once in his whole life he actually grabbed the one true thing in that entire house without meaning to, and it turned out to be worth more than every careful, curated, correct thing he'd ever handed me on purpose. I glanced over at him. Including himself, if I'm being honest. Elias didn't say anything clever back. He just took my hand plain and unhurried, the same way he'd once turned that watch under his loupe, like something worth being careful with, worth actually looking at, instead of something to be handed off in a hurry on the way out a door. The number doesn't float over everything anymore. It comes and goes now quieter, like it's finally satisfied I learned whatever lesson it originally showed up to teach me. But it flickered once, that afternoon, faint gold letters over our 2 joined hands, gone again before I could even be fully sure I'd seen it. I didn't need it to tell me the number on that one. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I already knew exactly what I was holding, and exactly what it was worth, and nobody, not a floating gold number, not a courtroom, not 4 generations of Ainsworths, was ever going to need to tell me again. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.